Welcome, everybody. Well, thank you for coming today. We appreciate you coming on what's a crowded schedule on Congressional Hill and in our political world right now. As I understand it, the Supreme Court just came down with another blockbuster a matter of a few minutes ago. And so it is an incredibly intense schedule of topics and the policy agenda in Washington today. And so we're grateful to all of you for joining us. We've got over, I believe, 150 people joining us online, as well as folks here at the University of Arizona DC Center in Washington. So welcome to all of you. I know we've got additional congressional staff that intended to come if they didn't get derailed by some of the news that continues to break. But we're delighted that you've joined us. I'm Keith Allred. I'm the Executive Director of the National Institute for Civil Discourse. And our event today is focused on whether bipartisan elections legislation is possible in 2022. Of course, bipartisan legislation seems to be almost always difficult in our polarized times, and even more so when we are less than 5 months out from a midterm congressional race that is being hotly contested for control of Congress. And yet, as we saw just last week, it is still possible to pass significant bipartisan legislation on matters of consequence on the most common sense measures available within a given pressing topic. And so this year, as the more than 42,000 members of Common Sense American looked at which issue would we pick to work on, and we try to pick on the most promising bipartisan issues. We define promising as the best combination of meaningful and achievable. By achievable, we kind of operationalize that in terms of, is there significant bipartisan support or interest already in Congress so that you could imagine actually getting something done. And as we shared a list of 10 promising issues derived from dozens of interviews with members of Congress and their staff in the White House, our members overwhelmingly chose bipartisan elections legislation as the topic, the most promising bipartisan topic to work on in 2022. And I think that's because our members believe two things. First, that elections legislation is not just a significant, but a crucial issue for us to address this year. The ability to trust that our representatives have been chosen by the voice of the people is bedrock for the most successful republic in history. It's hard to think of anything more fundamental and more crucial than measures that might be able to boost the trust that we can all have in our elections. Second, our members judged that the prospects for common sense elections legislation wise enough to attract bipartisan support were pretty decent in spite of the polarization and in spite of the oncoming midterm elections. And that was largely thanks to the good work already going in Congress by the time we picked that issue, especially the bipartisan group of 16 senators led by Senators Collins and Manchin. Senator Collins likes to call that group the Common Sense Coalition. Since we have our Common Sense American program, we're partial to that name for that group, so we'll refer to them as the Common Sense Coalition. But we'd had a number of conversations with them, and we're quite impressed with how far advanced they were in their conversations. And we have some staff here from that group of 16 senators. Significant work being done in the House, including members of the Select Committee on January 6th and the House Administration Committee. And so on a serious bipartisan basis, in a substantive way, there was real action and attention in the Congress. And given how crucial the topic is and those prospects that there did appear to maybe be at least a handful of common sense measures that could attract bipartisan support, our members picked this as the single most promising bipartisan issue to work on in 2022. Because they picked that meant that we developed a policy brief that our members then reviewed. And they commit an hour per year to reviewing the brief on the topic that we pick. So we get into some detail on the policy questions, and we looked at the most promising, a handful of the most promising common sense elections measures that were under serious consideration in the Congress. And in each case, we make the argument for and against each proposal. So we're not advocating a particular approach. We don't put our thumb on the scales, but we try to provide a broad swath of the American people substantial, good information to make their own judgment about what makes sense. In developing that brief, particularly this year, we were really grateful to have engaged with a couple of dozen, actually over 30 of the leading elections experts in the country, as we tried to make sure our brief captured all of the issues. And it's just been a phenomenal experience working with all of them. Impressive at the level of thoughtful consideration and substantive consideration. But also, we were really struck, we went out of our way to engage Republicans, Democrats, a wide range ideologically. And we were particularly struck on this issue by how much natural bipartisan consensus already existed among experts and leaders on elections. And so that's part of what we wanted to showcase today. And so we've got 11 of the 30 plus experts and leaders from across the country that we consulted with here with us today on the program, and in part because we wanted to demonstrate just how much consensus exists, even in our highly polarized times. We are going to then, in addition to showcasing some of the kind of expert agreement there is, we are going to announce our results. We've now had over 2,400 members of Common Sense American weigh in. It is a representative group of the country. They come from across the country and across the political spectrum. We're about 24% Democrats, about 24% Republicans, and about 45% independents from every state in the country. And as you'll see, there is in fact striking bipartisan support for Congress to act on some of the most obvious and essential common sense measures that can increase trust in our elections. So we'll get into the details of what those findings are over the course of the program today. But one of the favorite parts of our results, we ask each of our members whether they support or oppose each proposal that's reviewed in the brief. And so we're going to give you the quantitative results showing the percentage of support and oppose. But one of the favorite parts we have of our results is the open-ended. We ask our members, what would you most like to say to your members of Congress about this issue? And they are really our favorite parts, and in many ways the most telling of where the American people are on a given topic. In the interest of time, we'd love to just show you, of those 2,400 who have responded so far, we'd love to, spend a bunch of time just showing you those. But in the interest of time, I'm just going to show you one quick video that I think captures, is quite representative of the broad swath of the most common theme that we're hearing from our members who took, more than an hour each to really try to understand this issue. So we're going to let our friend Holly from Pennsylvania sort of stand in for the other 2,400 and give you a sense of what the American people are feeling about this topic right now.
Somebody just fainted.
That the desire for fair elections, free of fraud and corruption, is something all Americans can agree on. We can also all agree that we want clear laws and guidelines about each step of the process, from registering to vote through certification and everything in between.
In the end, it's fairly simple. We are a government by, for, and of the people. And having a set of rules that are clear and that we abide by, that give us trust in elections, just seems essential. And as you'll see in the specifics, everyday Americans believe there are a number of measures that Congress can act on that would boost trust in elections. So we'll start that examination of each of the topics with examining the Electoral Count Act. And then we will also be talking about the Presidential Transition Act, Election Worker Security, and state and local, federal funding for state and local elections. So we're going to start on the Electoral Count Act. I'll first announce our results, and then we'll have a distinguished panel on that point. And we start with the Electoral Count Act because that's really where Congress has begun the discussion. That is the sort of center of gravity of discussions. That's where I think it's fair to say the greatest energy and bipartisan interest is in doing something this year. It's where the group of 16 senators, the Common Sense Coalition led by Collins and Manchin, have maybe spent most of their time. And Congress has attended to that for good reason. The ECA establishes how and when states certify their electors in the Electoral College in the presidential race, and how they convey that to Congress, and then how Congress counts those acts. And of course, it has been for many years just a matter of course, for centuries, a matter of course, but over the last 2 decades, there have been escalating attempts on both sides of the aisle to exploit inadequacies in the Electoral Count Act to their advantage. And that has given rise to a sense of urgency that some updates be provided. The Electoral Count Act was passed in Congress in 1887. There is wide agreement that it is convoluted, antiquated, and extraordinarily difficult to interpret. And it just feels like essential that we make that as clear as possible. So our brief examined 5 major proposals to update the Electoral Count Act. There are others being considered, so this isn't the whole waterfront of it, but these are 5 of the most important that they're considering. And the first one that you've maybe heard the most about is clarifying the Vice President's role. So the question we asked to our members after they had studied this brief and the arguments for and against is, do you support or oppose clarifying that the Vice President has only ceremonial and procedural responsibilities? We get an overwhelming 92% of these 2,400 Americans from across the country and political spectrum agreeing that that should be clarified. 92% in these highly polarized times. That should tell you something about the agreement and urgency that the American people feel on this. On this particular question and 2 others, we dove down just a little deeper and we asked an additional question. We asked, well, what percentage of Republicans, members of Common Sense American Republicans, do you think would support this? What percentage of Democrats that are members of Common Sense American would support that? And we get a very interesting finding. So for Republicans think that about 67% of Democrats would support it. And in fact, 97% do. And when we ask Democrats, what percentage of Republicans do you think would support this? They think, yeah, about 41%, when in fact, 86% of Republicans support it. So each side significantly underestimates the amount of support the other side has for it. And that, of course, can have, I think there's sometimes that a little bit in Congress as well, and that can have some self-fulfilling prophecies to it, that we fail to act because we think we don't understand just how much agreement there is on this. So with respect to clarifying the Vice President's role, it is just an overwhelming finding of bipartisan support. So here's some of the other measures that we ask about. Congress must honor court's rulings. Do you support or oppose clarifying that Congress must honor court's rulings in ECA disputes? 80% support. Clarifying, do you support or oppose clarifying the limited grounds for objections in Congress to a slate of electors? The brief goes into the details of what those limited grounds should be, but we get 79% support for that. Clarifying post-election day limits. Do you support or oppose clarifying that after Election Day, a state legislature may only provide a new means to choose electors if there has been a major natural disaster or a similarly catastrophic event? And on the question of should the threshold be raised within Congress for raising objections beyond the current 1 senator and 1 member of the House, we found when we asked, do you support or oppose raising the threshold for objections to 1/4 of both the House and the Senate, we get 76% support. So at the very lowest, we get 3/4 support among the American people. It's just a striking degree of consensus among the American people. Now, Congress has started their consideration of elections legislation with the Electoral Count Act, and much of the debate going on, in a sense politically right now, is, okay, probably a fair amount of agreement on Electoral Count Act. Should we do something more than the Electoral Count Act? And in broad strokes, generally speaking, Democrats are making the argument that there's a number of other things that should be done around elections legislation, and it shouldn't just be the Electoral Count Act that gets done. And broadly, generally speaking, Republicans are a little more dubious about that and have a preference for a greater focus on just the Electoral Count Act, or maybe just one or two additional ones. So the question sort of becomes Electoral Count Act plus what? And we'll get into the details of some of those others that we consider. And again, we will show among the American people overwhelming consensus that there are other good common sense measures that should be passed. But I also want to point out that the American people are pretty practical and pragmatic about this. So we asked them this question about linking the various kinds of measures and said, do you support or oppose Electoral Count Act updates even if Congress does not pass other election measures that you support? And as you'll see, most of them support a whole bunch of others. But you really love these other measures. What if they can only do Electoral Count Act and not those others? 89% support that the Electoral Count Act warrants passage on its own merits, independent of what else Congress may pass. So again, I think that's quite a striking finding. So those are our findings on the Electoral Count Act. We'll now move to our illustrious panel to discuss this, and I'll come over and join them. So furthest to my right, not speaking ideologically necessarily, we have Rick Pildes. Rick Pildes is the Sudler Family Professor of Constitutional Law and co-director of the Program on Law and Security at NYU School of Law. And I'll tell you, as we were surveying the country and saying who really knows about the Electoral Count Act, Rick Pildes is always on that list. We have Professor Ned Foley, Chair in Constitutional Law and Director, Election Law at The Ohio State University. If you're going to do a Google on Electoral Count Act and see what's been published on it, you won't find anybody more prolific than Ned Foley on that. So we're very honored to have Ned with us today. Rick and Ned, more than anybody else, probably educated me on the Electoral Count Act, so I'm personally grateful to them for the education they provided. And then immediately to my right, we have Steve Bradberry, former General Counsel, Department of Transportation in the Trump administration, and particularly relevant for today, head of Office of Legal Counsel at the Department of Justice in the George W. Bush administration, the office at DOJ that weighs into these kinds of questions. And so, we're particularly honored to have Steve with us today as someone who hasn't been weighing in publicly to this point on the Electoral Count Act. And we said, we think you'd have a very interesting perspective given the roles you've played, and would you mind digging into this and sharing your thoughts? So we're delighted to have all of them. Before we get into our panel here, I'm just going to mention some of the others that have helped advise us on this. It is an all-star cast. Ben Ginsburg, Bob Bauer, Jack Goldsmith, Judge Michael McConnell, Courtney Elwood, and Judge Michael Ludig are just some of the others advising us on the Electoral Count Act, and we've been very grateful for that. So we're going to start by giving them each a couple of minutes to make opening statements, and then we'll get into some questions. I'll ask a question or two, and we'll see if the audience has any, including our in-person as well as online audience. So Rick, let's start with you and come down the row. And thank you, Rick.
All right, thanks very much, Keith, and thanks to the National Institute for Civic Discourse for both bringing us together, but also the kind of work you're doing trying to promote conversation across partisan lines and searching for common sense solutions. Our elections now take place and are going to take place in a sea of pervasive distrust from both sides of the spectrum. There's going to be concern, there is concern about whether state legislatures in the presidential election context may seek to second guess the voting process, the votes in the states in the presidential election. There's concern about whether secretaries of state, governors, possibly county canvassing boards will also find reasons to justify, at least in their own minds, questioning the popular vote with partisan advantage seeking, inevitably driving some of that motivation to second guess the partisan vote. There's also distrust at the national level about Congress and what role Congress might play in the resolution of a close presidential election in light of the more assertive role Congress has been taking, certainly, obviously in 2020, but going back to 2000, when members of Congress began to object to the votes from particular states. So the Electoral Count Act is a critical feature of trying to recreate a larger sense of legitimacy and stability about the presidential election outcome and the process. I think people underestimate the extent to which effective Electoral Count Act reform can actually deal with a lot of these risks of what we call election subversion that might take place in the states. So effective Electoral Count Act reform is not just about the vice president's role. It's not just about what role Congress might or might not take when the votes come in from the states. It's also about solidifying and clarifying that the state election process has to be conducted and votes have to be tabulated based on pre-existing law established in advance of the election, processes that are established in advance of the election, and that Congress will be bound, as it already is in the current statute, but not clearly enough, to accept the results that come through state processes established in advance of the election and adjusted as necessary by any state or federal court judicial decision-making that takes place during the process of resolving any controversies about the election. Congress shouldn't be in the role of second-guessing the voting processes in the states, but we have to ensure the integrity of that process in the states. And effective Electoral Count Act reform, although the issues are very technical, can really solidify the structure of the election process and help ensure greater legitimacy and stability to the outcome of the next presidential election.
Thank you, Rick. Ned?
Yeah, I agree completely with what Rick just said, so I don't want to repeat it except to say ditto, ditto, ditto. But just to amplify on that, I think it's important to understand that Congress's role under the 12th Amendment is to receive the electoral votes that have been cast by electors who are appointed pursuant to state law. You know, as a policy matter, we may not like the Electoral College, we may want to replace it, but that is the constitutional structure that we have. And as Rick said, states appoint their electors pursuant to their own laws and procedure. Now, they have to use the laws that they identify in advance of the appointment that occurs in November on what we call Election Day. That's because the same Constitution that gives state legislatures the right to choose the manner for appointing electors also allows Congress to specify the date or the time at which electors are appointed. So once state law has chosen a popular vote as the means for appointing electors, the state legislatures themselves are bound by their own chosen method because they have said this is our method for the electors to be appointed that first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. So they lock themselves in to their chosen method. And there's a set of procedures pursuant to state law with federal court oversight to the extent that equal protection and due process and other constitutional provisions supervise any popular vote that may occur pursuant to state law. Bush versus Gore teaches us that, as well as a lot of other cases. So there will be, if necessary, litigation and contestation over counting the popular vote and resolving that all before the electors themselves cast their electoral votes. Date is now mid-December. And it's important to separate that part of the process from what happens after the electors themselves cast their votes, because Congress's only role is to ask itself, do we know that we have electoral votes from electors who were appointed pursuant to state law? If the answer to that question is yes, okay, you know, these are Florida's electors, or these are Alabama's electors, or Georgia's. Congress is not a recount board for the popular vote. Congress just identifies, do we have the authentic electoral votes from a state, meaning not counterfeit. You know, we know that this is what the state government has actually sent us. There was a dispute back in the 19th century, 1876 Hayes-Tilden, when there was legitimate contestation over which body of state government was sending the official votes from a state. We haven't seen anything like that since then, and all the objections that have taken place, as Keith pointed out, since 2000 have been improper if you understand that it's not Congress's role to second guess the procedures leading to the appointment of electors, but only to assure itself that it has what Florida sent in 2000, or what Ohio sent in 2004, or what any of the states sent in 2016, or what any of the states sent in 2020. And that is why, as Rick said, this is really what the current Electoral Count Act is designed to do under a provision that says Congress is supposed to treat as conclusive any dispute resolution procedures that have been adopted for clarifying who the appointed electors are. But Congress itself has lost sight of their own promise to treat those procedures as conclusive. So a revised Electoral Count Act that clarifies in 21st century language that Congress does its job, which is to authenticate that it's got what the states have sent, means that you can achieve two purposes. As Rick said, you can rely on existing procedures to make sure that states follow their own rules for the appointment of electors and don't try to redo the rules after the popular votes have been cast. And then Congress itself doesn't attempt to undo what has been done pursuant to law by binding itself in the way that Rick identified to what the states properly sent. So that's what I would say is the focus of attention as we move forward.
Thank you, Ned. Steve?
Keith, thank you. And it's an honor to be here. I want to thank the Institute for the good work you're doing on these important issues. As Ned said, the 12th Amendment assigns to Congress as a body the role of counting the presidential electoral votes. It doesn't assign that to the President of the Senate, that's the Vice President. It doesn't assign it to any other individual member of Congress. But the authority to count the votes necessarily includes the implied authority to decide which votes to count and how and when to count them. Now, the best way for Congress to exercise that authority is by a clear statute in advance of any dispute over a count. Congress tried to do that in the Electoral Count Act in 1887. On its face, it's not unconstitutional because I think it's consistent with that role for Congress under the Constitution. But clearly, it's out of date, it's unclear, and it can be applied in a constitutionally dubious way in individual disputes. So it needs to be amended. And the proposals that have been made are good ones. I think this is the right project, and it is an urgent need to consider. I think that the actions we saw from Vice President Pence on January 6, 2021, affirmed that the Vice President's role is ceremonial and is not a substantive one. And that's consistent with the practice that Congress has applied really for more than 200 years. So a sensible amendment to the Electoral Count Act should include a clear and certain process for determining what is the official list of electors from each state, and that there's only one list, and then should provide that Congress may only count the votes of those officially certified electors from each state. If there are doubts about that, because there may be a recount or doubts about the outcome of the popular vote in a particular state, that should be resolved at the state level or in the courts. And then Congress should honor the results of those court decisions that are binding on the state election officials. That leaves only a narrow category of objections that could be raised and resolved in Congress to the individual electors or their votes. For example, the eligibility of electors or whether the vote is a problem. If it's inconsistent with a state faithful elector requirement or perhaps has been obtained through corruption, Congress has to have the ability to resolve that dispute. But objections should not be raised if only one member of the House and Senate makes the objection. That's the current law. That threshold should clearly be raised. I would recommend 1/5 of each House. That's 20 senators and 87 representatives. And that would have knocked out all of the objections that have been raised since 2000. I think that's a healthy threshold. And then Congress as a body can resolve those objections. The last thing I'll say is there is a provision that Keith mentioned in the current Electoral Count Act that says if the state has failed to conduct an orderly election, it can do a do-over in the election. And obviously, I think that does need to be clarified to make it very clear that that's only if the failure to conduct an orderly election is because of a natural disaster, a terrorist attack, a foreign invasion or insurrection. It should be a very limited set of those circumstances. Thanks, Keith.
Excellent. So as Congress is, we're all aware of how rapidly the midterm elections are approaching. It's a busy agenda on Capitol Hill. The group of 16 senators, the members of the Select Committee and the House Admin Committee are all very aware of that and are working frantically to see if there's something they could get done yet in 2020. If you could wave your wand and you could say, well, here's one, I know all of you think there's a range of things that should be done, but if you were just to pick one or a couple of what you think are the most essential and most consequential things that you think Congress should act on and act now, and you could wave your wand and that could get through Congress, what would those be if we were at the a little more specific level of particular aspects of the Electoral Count Act that would get updated? Why don't we go in the same order that we went before, Rick?
Well, I'm not going to answer that directly because we speak on these issues. We are asked by members of Congress for our views on these issues, and I'm not going to engage in Sophie's choice here and abandon provisions that I think are important. But what I will say is we have this strange situation of a law that is incredibly important and yet is highly technical, and legislators get no credit for doing anything about updating the act. And so we are in this kind of difficult dynamic in which it's extremely important that this get done. I think it's important that it get done soon before Congress moves towards elections in the fall and the lame duck session and a new Congress coming together. But because it's so technical and because there's minimal public interest and congressmen will get no credit for it, I think it takes a lot of consistent sessions like this, commentary, and efforts to really let members of Congress know how important this issue is for the country.
Good. Thanks, Rick. Ed?
Well, I guess I would say that the points that Steve was making, which I think we're essentially all in agreement here, some of the subsidiary technical fixes, if you will, or clarifications are all in service of the same overriding philosophy. So I would say, job one is to have Congress embrace that overriding philosophy, which I hope should not be controversial because there is cross-partisan consensus that that's the right philosophy. It also is the philosophy underlying the existing statute that is antiquated and outdated. So I think it's just a recommitment to common ground, common sense, common ground. And once you've got that recommitment, some things flow from that. And so one of the things that flows from that, as Steve says, is that means Congress honors what the courts do. If the courts adjudicate recounts or contestations over the popular vote, that needs to happen before the electors cast their own votes, because the Constitution also says that every state must cast their electoral votes on the same day. There's a national uniformity requirement there. So there must be, from a constitutional perspective, resolution on who the electors are in each and every state prior to the date that Congress picks, which is now, again, mid-December. So, if that process goes, is adjudicated in the courts, that will resolve doubts. There shouldn't be any doubt about who the electors are of each state. And then that's why the statute can piggyback on that and say, okay, Congress knows what to do. So I think a couple of key components, including the need to fix the failed election provision, because I agree, right now it should not be thought of as a common sense proposition that a state legislature can say, we don't like the result of the popular vote and therefore we'll call it a failed election. I think we all know that just doesn't work, but it ought to be easy to tighten up that language and say, no, it's a hurricane, it's a natural disaster, it's not, you don't like the result.
Good. Thank you, Ned. Steve?
Thanks, Keith. Well, I guess I'm not involved in counseling any of the committees in the Hill or involved in the legislative discussions. So I can just say what I think, and I can be very specific, I guess, and to go a little bit deeper on what I said in my opening remarks. I think I'd focus on two main things to really eliminate largely the potential for mischief and contention under the Electoral Count Act. Number one, and let me stop and say, I really recommend everybody take a look at a report. I'm a conservative Republican, but Representative Zoe Lofgren on the House, she's the chair of the House Committee on House Administration. Her staff did a report back in January, which I think is an excellent report. They did a great deep dive into the history of the historical precedents and application of the Electoral Count Act, analysis of both sides of the issues and recommendations. And it just was a great resource for me in getting up to speed on these issues. I recommend it to everyone. And sort of consistent with many of the recommendations in the Lofgren report, I would say, number one, set out in the amended statute a clear and certain process to achieve one official certified list of electors who've been officially appointed by the state pursuant to the popular vote conducted under state law, pre-existing state law on election day. And that's easier said than done. I think a clear, simple way to do it would be to require, let's say, the governor of the state to certify to Congress the official list. Now that would represent the outcome of the popular vote election in that state. So there has to be a period of time where the governor could, if necessary, correct the list if there's a recount that flips the result. If the governor refuses to submit the list or submits competing lists, or there's some anomaly like that, that's subject to, that can be challenged in the courts under state law, potentially under federal law, and should be resolved before the electors get together to meet and vote, cast their ballots. And then Congress, as we say, must honor those resolutions. That eliminates the vast majority of pernicious issues over recontesting the vote in any state and the outcome of the popular vote, the election. Congress should not be in the business of doing that, in counting the votes of the electors. The other major thing is the threshold for objections. So you've just eliminated the biggest, most explosive categories of objections to a more limited set, and then for raising those, raise the threshold. It shouldn't be enough for one member of each chamber, one member of each House of Congress in writing to object, and then you have to go through 2 hours of debate over that. It should be raised to a substantial threshold. I recommended 1/5 of each House, and then they should be allowed to try to persuade the rest of their colleagues to go along with that objection. But those two fundamental reforms would really go a long way toward eliminating the potential for mischief under the Act.
Excellent. Let's see if there's any questions. I don't know if someone's got a mic handy, but any questions from the audience? Debbie Lynn? Debbie Lynn, why don't you go ahead and, Jason will get you there. Jason's got the mic for you here.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for this thoughtful, both research and study and all of your expertise on this. My question is about how will this mitigate or eliminate the possibility of people who don't want to follow the rules? And if you have any thoughts or suggestions about people who then consider themselves outside the rule of law, because, and just as a personal point, I really think democracy is how we settle disagreements in this country. It's where we argue about the process of settling conflict. What we're seeing right now is people who don't want to use the agreed upon process to settle. So
real quick, I think there's two categories of potential officials who might not be rule followers, unfortunately. And Rick alluded to this. To the extent that it's happening in the states, either state election officials or the legislatures of a state or something, I think we do rely on the courts. I think if a state legislature would try to repudiate its own rules for how to hold a popular vote, it can't do that after the popular vote has been held if this failed election provision is tightened in the way that it should be. So I think you can rely on the judicial process to keep state officials in line. I think both state and federal courts as appropriate under existing jurisdictional statutes. I actually think because of the objections that members of Congress have made since 2000 that are improper for the reasons that we've described, I think we have to worry about members of Congress not being rule followers. And that, in my judgment, is why the need for this revised statute is so imperative, because if it is adopted, it will need to be adopted on a bipartisan basis. So it's an institutional, bilateral, bipartisan self-commitment on the part of Congress that it wants to be rule of law oriented in the resolution of a presidential election. And so, as important are the details of the amendment, I think just the fact of amending it in this way is an important statement by Congress that it wants to obey its own rules.
Good. Anything else you want to add on that? Or go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, I agree with Ned, particularly at the state officials, governor, legislature, whatever, resolved in the courts. Congress, that decides it for Congress's purposes. But it's also possible that the electors themselves act improperly. And an elector could be ineligible under the Constitution. The Constitution says no presidential elector may be an official, a government official of the federal government, an officer of the federal government. It could be possible you could discover that one who's on the official list is an officer of the federal government. Congress has to be able to declare that vote and that elector ineligible. Now that would, I think, reduce the denominator that you count. Remember under the Constitution, the president is not elected by the popular vote. The president has to get a majority of the electoral votes. A majority of what? A majority of all of the duly appointed electors. But if an elector is ineligible, then he or she has not been appointed an elector, I would say. It would reduce the denominator. If you have, on the other hand, an accusation that is genuine of corruption, let's say the elector is alleged to have switched his vote because he took a bribe. Okay, I think Congress, or he has voted inconsistent with a state faithful elector requirement. 32 states require electors to vote consistent with their commitments to the candidates they represent. I think if the elector has voted inconsistent with a state faithful elector statute, Congress has to have the authority to correct that vote consistent with the state law. If the elector is shown to have taken a bribe and switched his vote based on corruption, Congress has to have the ability to disregard that vote. Again, the threshold for these objections should be high, and the grounds for it should be clear and compelling, and Congress decides that at the joint meeting on January 6th. If an elector's vote has been knocked out because of corruption, that would not change the denominator. So it's theoretically possible that could affect the outcome of the presidential election, but that, I think, is the role that Congress, I mean, that the framers intended for this electoral count in Congress. This is the final formal ratification of the outcome of the election. It's important. It should be ceremonial. We should eliminate, as far as we can in advance, through an Electoral Count Act statute that's clear and well done, most of the bases for contention, so that largely it's a foregone conclusion. But you have to have a process to resolve any remaining objections in an orderly way. And I think that's the best way to avoid the kind of potential nightmare potential for violence or what have you that we've seen and we're now contemplating. So,
excellent. In the interest of time, we're going to move on to the other topics, but I just want to point out, just in hearing these three, how much consensus there really is, how much is really quite obvious and compelling that should be done. And I would just say, in our experience, that extends vastly beyond the three on this stage. And so there really is, in addition to everyday Americans thinking, there's quite a bit that's quite clear there's quite a bit of a basis for Congress to act on some truly meaningful updates that would increase trust in our elections results. So Rick, Ned, Steve, thanks for the education to all of us on this topic.
Thank you.
Good. So we're now going to move to the Presidential Transition Act as the next area for examination of measures that Congress might adopt in 2022. The Presidential Transition Act, the PTA as it is known, provides for the transition resources for the President and Vice President-elect. That is, when we have ascertained, is the language of the Act, the eventual likely winner, then Congress has decided that, those candidates should be provided with extensive resources to get ready to govern so that they can govern effectively from day one. And so a whole stream of resources from offices and computers to interactions and briefings from members of the executive branch are provided for. The need perhaps for updating the Presidential Transition Act has become highlighted because twice in the last 2 decades, the ascertainment of who should get those has been delayed. First in 2000 in the wake of the Bush v. Gore disputes, and then most recently in 2020. And in each case, then, the transition resources were delayed by a few weeks, and so the question has been raised, should we provide greater clarification for when and how those resources are transferred? The Presidential Transition Act puts that authority in the administrator of the General Services Administration, and as the administrator under the Trump administration herself said, there's no guidance in the act for how to determine when the eventual winner has been achieved. So why should the General Services Administrator be burdened with that without giving any guidance? So there's been a search for, are there ways of tightening that up to avoid those delays so that presidents can be ready to govern on day one. So I'm going to first talk about our results on the Presidential Transition Act. And then I'll introduce our distinguished panel to have a discussion about that. There's a number of kind of technical and somewhat, in some ways difficult questions about how exactly do you tighten that up so that you could make that decision quicker and have the full flow of transition resources go more quickly. I'll share 3 that we ask our members about. One idea has been to simply share the full resources with both candidates in the event there is a legitimate delay in the ascertainment of who the likely winner is. And you say, well, no need to pinch pennies and keep the flow. Let's get them both ready to roll right away. So if there's much of a delay at all, let's just share it with both. So we put that to our members and found over 70% support for that proposition. And I think that is a proposition that the group of 16 senators is certainly considering seriously. We also asked about 2 other approaches to that. One is to provide for criteria for ascertainment. Now, there's some technical details here that in the interest of time, I'm not going to get into, but along with our panelists, we've got framed up some ways of doing this that you sort of say, okay, here's a number of legitimate criteria, and when the earliest of these are met, then the flow of resources should begin, or else the administrator has a duty to say why she or he isn't doing that. And we had 71% support for that proposition. A third idea is to create a bipartisan advisory board of people who do have expertise in elections, which the General Services Administrator typically does not. And they meet as a bipartisan advisory board, and when they ascertain that we have a likely eventual winner, that they convey that to the General Services Administrator, and then she or he either honors that and begins the flow of full transition resources, or else has to explain why. And we get 59% support for that proposition. So those are, again, a case where it's actually fairly easy to find bipartisan support among everyday Americans for some sort of obvious updates in any one. You could do any one of these three, and you get a fair amount of support for that. So we want to now transition to talking about folks who spent some real time thinking about these issues and how the Presidential Transition Act could best function. And so I'll introduce our panels, and we'll have that discussion. So furthest to my right, again, not designating any particular ideological position, we have Norm Ornstein, who will be known to many of you as one of the great public minds on congressional reform of various sorts, including the Presidential Transition Act. He's the Senior Fellow Emeritus at American Enterprise Institute and former co-director of the AEI Brookings Election Reform Project. Norm, thanks for joining us today. And Professor Michael Hertz, the Arthur Kaplan Professor of Law at Cardozo School of Law, who has published kind of the most definitive law review articles on the topic, along with his colleague at Cardozo Law School, Kate Shaw, who also was helpful in educating us in drafting our brief to educate Americans on the presidential transition. Norman, Michael, thank you for joining us.
Good to be here.
We'll again let each of you make a couple-minute opening statement of your thoughts on updates of the Presidential Transition Act.
Sure, I'll start. Just a word of warning. I'm at an age and stage where I don't restrain my beliefs on things. A larger comment to start with. The Constitution and the laws are kind of the exoskeleton of a political system. The norms are the ligaments and tendons. And if you don't have the norms, the whole thing collapses. A part of what we are considering here is a situation that we had in 2020 where the norms collapsed. And in a larger sense, and that includes the Presidential Transition Act, it includes the Electoral Count Act, and many, many more things, we cannot start by assuming good faith by the actors. We are no longer in that position. And frankly, I'm very concerned. You know, the current definition of an optimist is somebody who believes the future is uncertain. I'm not even that much of an optimist at this point. I think we are, if you look at the arc of Supreme Court decisions of the last 2 weeks and what we have remaining, and what we know is on the docket, the independent state legislatures doctrine is likely to be not just applied to presidential electors. I think we're on the verge of having it apply to state elections. This court is going to rule out state courts. An assumption that we're making here, that Congress has to defer to courts, assumes that the courts are on the up and up. And I don't believe that anymore. I'll tell you frankly, I looked before we started this morning at the latest case, which is a second case that basically completely blows up the Establishment Clause of the Constitution. It's about a coach who prayed at the 50-yard line following a football game. In that decision, Justice Gorsuch said the coach was by himself. The players, the others were off doing their own business. There's a picture of them all the players gathered around the 50-yard line with the coach. Players thinking, if I don't pray with this coach, I'm not going to get on the field anymore. So I don't see this as good faith action, and I'm afraid we see that throughout the judiciary. I'm not sure I'm going to count on Congress. I certainly wouldn't count on necessarily the head of the General Services Administration basically following the law and following the traditions of the country. So in a larger sense, we're going to have to look at all of these reforms, first of all, with some dismay that they might not work in any case. If you follow the January 6th hearings, you know that what happened in 2020 was a beta test. They've learned some lessons. And a process where you could have, you can say Congress is only supposed to look at this in terms of a natural disaster. If you have a state legislature that says, we don't believe that this was the popular vote, We're going to say what the popular vote was and who the winner was, and that's the slate of electors we're going to send to Congress. And Congress says, which they may or may not do, no, that's not right. The Supreme Court is going to step in and say, sorry, you don't have a role here, it's the state legislatures. So we could have a constitutional crisis down the road. And all of that obviates what might happen with a presidential transition process. I believe in these reforms. I think we need to go even further. We ought to basically allow presidential candidates to begin a vetting process for nominees to executive positions, because we get a clog at the beginning of a new administration and you can't even fill those positions, and that's gotten even worse with a Senate that basically tries to delay as many as possible. But at minimum, this is something that we need to do. And then we have to hope and pray that somehow the better angels of people emerge. I wish I could be an optimist.
All right. Well, I mean, I agree that this is a time when norms seem to be in retreat and norms are a slender reed. There's one norm which is a steady, rock-solid oak, and that's Norm Ornstein. A new president has 2.5 months between the time he or she gets the job and he or she starts the job. And it's no time at all. It's no time at all. And the transition process is frenetic and difficult and chaotic and essential. And any delay is not just bad for the administration, though it's clearly that, it's bad for the country. The starkest and best known example is, the 9/11 Commission's conclusion and Congress's conclusion represented in legislation in 2004. That part of what happened in 9/11 could be traced back to the delay in the transition in 2000. They did not have the national security people in place, adequately vetted, and obviously, who knows? But it's a reminder that this really matters, and not just for the incoming administration, but for the country. So the delay we saw in 2020 is serious, and as Keith said, it is the result in part of structural deficiencies in the Presidential Transition Act, and in particular that the money, the big money, and the main support and the access and information, which is critical in addition to just money, is triggered by the GSA administrator saying, I now see who's the apparent successful candidate. A lot of resources are available earlier, as Norm said, and the pattern over the decades has been to shift more and more resources to both candidates before the election. The original Presidential Transition Act gave nothing until after the election, and it's been a healthy move earlier. But it is still an inflection point, the election itself, and one has to get the winner identified quickly. Obviously, you need to have the information. In 2000, there was genuine uncertainty. In 2020, there was somewhat less uncertainty. And the weak point here is placing the decision with the GSA administrator. And the question is, what kind of response should we have? One possibility is to tie the administrator's hands more, right, with particular detailed criteria, a rule rather than a standard. That would give her less wiggle room. It would protect a good faith administrator from presidential influence and so on. It's very hard to get those criteria right. It's very hard to know what the issue is going to be in the next election. And the other is to structurally set it up so that either it's placed with someone else or the incentives are different for the administrator. So there are a lot of actually different approaches one might take. These three proposals are not the only three one might have gone with, but they are a sensible response to the basic problem, which is the wrong person, wrong because a lack of expertise, wrong because of a weird set of incentives, and wrong because vulnerable to pressure, and wrong because it's someone with a dog in the fight is making the decision.
Excellent. Let me just see if there are any, let's start with any questions from the audience or our panelists here. Yeah, go ahead. Right. Helen, why don't we give her the microphone, let her repeat the question so our online audience can hear.
Is the GSA administrator appointed by the president?
Yes.
Appointed by the president with the advice and consent of the Senate. And it's actually, there's a little phrase in the statute which may be, it's not clear its legal significance. It would sort of depend on who you ask and what they think the president's inherent authority is. But it does expressly say the GSA administrator will perform his tasks or something like this under the direction of the president, right? It's explicit in the statute, this sort of perhaps unnecessary but nonetheless telling statement that those tasks are performed at the direction of the president.
And let's keep in mind that, yeah, let's keep in mind that this GSA administrator also ruled earlier on the then Trump Hotel, which was a federal building under a lease in which the lease signed by Donald Trump for his organization said that if he assumed any public office, of course, it would be a direct violation of the Emoluments Clause, that he would step away from the hotel, and the administrator basically gave him free rein to keep the hotel. So this is not a good process anymore. When we consider the GSA administrator as somebody who gets leases for federal buildings, decides where an agency will go, whether the FCC is going to stay in its current place as it was then up near DuPont Circle or move down by the waterfront. That's an important set of decisions. And you also want to have a president have some control there because the possibilities of corruption are extremely high. But this is a different matter entirely.
Good. Let me just ask you of those ranges of mechanisms out there for sort of avoiding delays in the future. Do you have a favorite? Do you feel like, yeah, there really are any one of these would obviously be better? Kind of comment on your thoughts about if you were advising Congress what to do to make sure we don't delay transitions in the future. What would your advice be?
When these deliberations were going on, I proposed the Bipartisan Advisory Committee. I think you have to take this out of the hands of any political actor. And, you know, in a larger sense, we are the only established democracy that has election officials who are partisans. We shouldn't have partisan officials dealing with any element of this process. We need to move in the direction of independent expertise. And I don't think it would be difficult to create a kind of advisory panel that would act on the up and up.
Right. I really appreciate both of them working with us and kind of frame this up in a more detailed way. And I think, Norm, this was your idea, but kind of the A and B. You have the Bipartisan Advisory Panel. They make a determination, advise the General Services Administrator, but you give just a little bit of, you know, maybe making it a little more expedient to get it done. Say, if the General Services Administrator doesn't abide by that, then you have a duty to explain why and explain yourself. So I kind of appreciate the kind of thinking through of how to do that.
You know, I would also say more broadly, we need to think more broadly about this in any case. If we're going to have a 2.5-month period between the time of an election and the time of an administration, and if you have 1,000 presidential appointees who have to go through a Senate confirmation process, and you have a requirement that's in an Eisenhower-era executive order that all Senate confirmable nominees have to have a background check, and it's the full FBI background check. And the regulations of the FBI say that the appointees come in and they're put in a queue in order. It's chaotic. You cannot start an administration that way. And what we've seen is even if you reduce the threshold for executive appointees from 60 to 50 in the Senate, it didn't eliminate the filibuster. We're seeing now inordinate delays and ways in which you can block nominees from moving forward. It's no way to run a country. It has less to do with a president and more to do with the ability of an administration to be able to act in ways that serve the public interest. We got to cut the number of presidential appointees who have to go through this process. We have to streamline the security background checks. There's no reason why the Assistant Secretary of Education for Public Affairs needs the same vetting as the Secretary of Defense or the Secretary of State. All of that needs to be a part and parcel of this. And as I said earlier, there's no, you can say, well, you don't want to, basically bribe people by offering them a public office. That's not something you allow. But without setting a specific office, designating a group of people in the aftermath of an election to begin the security process so that they're ready to go early in an administration to be vetted, those should be common sense things to do.
Excellent. Michael? Any other pets or ones that you'd recommend?
Well, I think that I think the key thing is who's making the decision, less than the criteria or the standards according to which. At the end of the day, it's going to be a judgment call. The more you try and constrain the judgment, the more risk you're getting it wrong. You've got to put it in the right place. I think the bipartisan commission is a good idea. Your model is that these are private parties, and thus are not literally going to be making the decision.
Yeah.
One might also think about what other governmental officials who have more independence and more expertise than does the head of the GSA might be appropriate. If I could pick one, I'd say the Comptroller General. It's probably unconstitutional because of a case called Boucher versus Sinar. But the Comptroller General has the right set of kind of expertise, standing, gravitas, and independence to actually do it.
I agree.
Good. To conclude, well, I think, go ahead, Steve. Yeah. Let me just repeat the question real quick because our online audience I don't think could hear it. We didn't get a mic and quick, but I think Steve's question is, isn't it wise to just avoid the whole trying to figure out the ascertainment and get all the resources going and to comment on that? Is that a fair restatement of the question?
You could do it, and of course that's one of the proposals here. The proposal is if ascertainment's delayed, but you could certainly do it. I think in most cases it's going to be unnecessary because most of the time we actually know who won most of the time the current system works. So it would be and two, it has real costs, including it just is not going to be effective if there are two groups simultaneously planning to run the country. So think about like meetings with agency officials, right? You're trying to develop relations with career staff. You're trying to learn what's going on. Are they telling each side the same thing? What kind of relationships are being developed? Think about the national security stuff. There's going to be huge hesitancy to telling everything to two groups when only one of them is going to end up in the White House. So I think it's going to be an ineffective transition if you have parallel processes for two groups.
And I would just add on to that my concern would be in a tribal environment, a clear loser could use that kind of information to attack the winner of the election. So there are unintended consequences of doing it. I mean, my initial judgment was, yeah, sure, why not? Let's put the money out there. But there might be some cost to that.
Good. I might come back just as we conclude this portion then and say all of that, and some kind of tough questions. I guess the impression that I've had, and just a quick answer on this, there exist any number of reasonable improvements. Many of these would be a significant improvement over what we currently have.
Yep.
Excellent. Thank you both for
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, we're going to now move to the last two topics that are those that we've considered that are under active consideration in the Congress, and we'll consider them together, and I'll share the two results, and then we'll have a single panel, this time of state and local election officials available to comment on both. So we're first going to talk about election worker security, and then the idea of increased federal funding for state and local governments to administer elections. So starting with election worker security, another set of proposals being considered around protecting those who do the work to make sure we all can cast our votes on election day, and a clear rise in the threats to those election workers. In fact, to the point that it's getting difficult to retrain or even recruit new election workers because of the kind of personal threats that they're coming under. So a variety of measures have been discussed about what could be done to improve election workers. And again, I think this one is maybe the least mature in the discussions in Congress about, I think there's wide agreement election workers ought to be secure. Exactly what the role of the federal government might be to increase the security of election workers is maybe not as ripe as some of these other discussions. But it's certainly a strong consensus that probably something needs to be done at the federal and or state level. So we looked at a couple of proposals that we'd heard on this, and I'll share those results. So one question is whether there ought to be federal criminal penalties. Arguably, there are existing federal penalties that could be used, but to make those a little clearer and beef those up. So the question was, do you support or oppose establishing federal criminal penalties for threatening, intimidating, or harassing election workers? Again, we see 81% support. That's overwhelming bipartisan support. And again, this phenomenon of each party underestimating how much the other party supports it. And so when we ask Republicans, what percentage of Democrats do you think would support doing that? They said, yeah, 65%, nearly 2/3, but in fact, 96% of Democrats support it. And then we asked Democrats, well, what percentage of Republicans do you think would support this? And they said, oh, 39%, not even very close to a majority. But it turns out that a clear 57% majority of Republican members of Common Sense Americans support that. So again, far more agreement than we tend to think exists out there across the partisan divide. A couple of other measures that the federal government could take to increase protection of election workers. Privacy protections. One of the forms that threats are increasingly taking is that the home address, for example, of election workers are published publicly, and then, or their phone numbers, social media accounts, and then they just get flooded with threats in person in their neighborhood, people showing up at their home, or online texts, phone calls, and at volumes and levels that are truly intimidating. And so one thing that could be done is just to extend existing federal privacy protections to make it explicit that covers state and local election workers. And we got 84% support for doing that. Again, overwhelming bipartisan support. Another one is to increase federal investigation resources, so to investigate the threats and communicate and make state and local election workers aware of them and provide resources for dealing with them. There is a fair amount that is provided already, and so a question of, does there need to be more of those? We got 79% support for that. So those are our findings on protecting election worker security. The next one we're going to go to is state and local elections funding. And the idea here is that, if we want to increase trust in elections, then one thing that we could do is simply invest more in how we administer them. And, question of, is the level at which we're currently funding them adequate to the sort of stresses that we're putting our election system under? And if it would be appropriate for the federal government to provide more funding than it already does. It does provide some funding. And so we put that to our members, as well as some information about what the current levels of election funding and what that need is. And I'll share with you some of these results. So at the level of $500 million per year for state and local elections that are kind of general and ongoing, we got 63% support. at the level of a similar level, but a kind of one-time funding for specific needs, which is the way the federal government has tended to do it in the past. We got 60% support. We did not get bipartisan majorities above that 500 million mark. So at the level of 1 billion per year, we got 47% support, and the level at 2 billion per year at 32% support. I'll just point out that this, the brief and the questionnaire has been up for about 6 or 7 weeks now, and this is the one, these are the only items in which we've seen movement over time, and the support has declined over time. And to me, my interpretation of that is that people are increasingly sober about the state of the economy and about inflation, and increasingly sensitive about federal spending. And so it's been interesting to kind of watch that one as the only one that moves over time. So where we're going to go from here is on the state and local funding piece, we really did some additional measures to kind of make sure we understood and could brief our members appropriately. And so we're going to have 2 distinguished experts come up and share a few of their thoughts and their work on the question of state and local funding. In the first instance, we're going to hear from Charles Stewart, distinguished professor at MIT, and who runs the Distinguished Election Lab at MIT. And we were asking, he's known as the premier empiricist on elections in the country. And so, you know, we went to him and we said, well, what is the funding need? I mean, rather than just saying, should we do more, can we kind of quantify a bit of what the funding need is? And in classic Charles Stewart fashion, he says, yeah, I've done work on it, others have, let me go take a look at it. Then he came back and he said, you know, there really doesn't exist a report currently that's not a kind of advocacy report that just comments on it. So I'll write one. So he wrote one for us. He wrote a 17-page one. That is classic Charles Stewart. So we're going to invite him up in a minute to speak on what we know about the funding need. And then we'll invite Charles Becker to come up. Charles Becker, who runs the, and Charles, I have forgotten the name of your organization. So you say, David, what did I say? David Becker. Center for Election Innovation and Research. Also just a widely recognized expert in this field, and who works a lot with state and local election officials. And so he helped us convene an impressive group of state and local election officials to kind of discuss this and make sure we were getting their input. And so we wanted to give each of them a few minutes to talk about their work on this and the insights that it provides. And then I'll introduce our panel of state and local election officials, and we'll invite them to speak both on the question of election worker security and funding. Charles?
Thanks, Keith. I assume y'all can hear me. And not to draw attention to this fact, but I understand that I'm one of the people standing between y'all and lunch. And so I will try to be even faster than I normally am. I mean, thanks to Keith and the Institute for the good work on this topic and many, many others. What I'm going to be talking about, as Keith mentioned, is efforts to support financially state and local election officials. And this is an area that I would argue has been a problem in America for many, many decades, and has been at the root of some of the most important failures that have led to crises, and in some cases constitutional crises, performance crises over the last 2 decades. So for instance, if we think about the 2000 election with hanging Chad and those sorts of things, if you dig into that controversy, it is easy to see how we backed into that controversy because of underfunding of election machines, underfunding of voter registration systems, underfunding of just the core blocking and tackling of election administrations, not only in Florida, but throughout the country. And we can go through other years, 2012, with long lines due to the underservicing of core support for polling places, or in 2016 and 2020, 2016, cybersecurity problems that in many cases were impossible to respond to at the state and local level because of the failure to support secretaries of state and county election officials in some core tasks. In 2020, of course, the issue was COVID. And election officials oftentimes living on the margin, unable to make the pivot without the assistance of state, federal, private philanthropy to make the election run. So this is really about, we've heard already about important issues related to the norms of elections, not only the Norm Ornstein's, but the larger norms of elections, the larger issues of elections. But this is really about the blocking and tackling of elections and making sure that regardless of what else is going on in the society, that our elections can be decided by the intention of the voters who go to the polls or cast their ballots by mail. So Keith helped me with the shameless promotion and shilling of the report. I encourage y'all to take a look at this report. Go to electionlab.mit.edu and you will get access to the full report. I just want to make a few points from that report. That report, first of all, touches on a number of topics. And as Keith said, there have been little papers here and there have been some kind of advocacy groups, very good groups that have written briefs in favor of greater funding, but all this material hasn't been brought together. And this is really the purpose of this report, is to bring this material together to help, first of all, identify what it costs to run elections in the United States, who finances elections in the US, and then to talk a bit about the arguments, pro and con, for the federal role in helping to support financially running elections, and thinking about what that amount might be if we agree that the federal government has an ongoing role, in addition to the role, or besides the role that's been playing over the last 20 years. So quickly, what does it cost to run elections in the US? Nobody knows. But from the best we can tell, it costs probably about $5 billion to run a national election, including everything. Now, to provide some scale, state and local governments spend about $2 trillion a year. So this is about 1% of all state and local spending. It's about what localities spend to run municipal parking garages every year. That's about the scale. The federal government has contributed roughly almost $4 billion to elections over the last 20 years. So again, to overly simplify, but nonetheless, if you just think about $5 billion a year for 20 years, that's about $100 billion. Roughly 4 of that was paid by the federal government. So to a first approximation, as we say at MIT, although in $1 billion here, $1 billion there, pretty soon you're talking $2 billion. I mean, it's nothing to be sneezed at. Nonetheless, in the grander scheme of things, even though it's a small amount of money, the federal government has not been a player in the ongoing support for state and local elections. So $5 billion is about the order of magnitude. How are elections financed? Elections are primarily financed at the local level. They're primarily financed out of general government revenues, which in most places is property taxes. What do we know about the service provision of any public good, public service that's driven by property taxes? Most important thing we know is that the degree of service is driven by the wealth of the community. So this also means that while there's about $5 billion, let us say, being spent in a federal election year to run elections, there's great variability in what's being spent, and it may very well be that that $5 billion is inadequate. There are some places that send mail, all sorts of things to their voters all the time, have great websites, have modern equipment, have professional staff. There's other places that just do good enough to get the machines into the polling places when they have to be there and count the votes, and leave it up to the voters to figure out where to go and when to get there and what the results are. Okay, so we probably need to raise the level of spending to bring a large number of local jurisdictions up to some level of service that we would expect all places to follow. So, should the feds pay? One, there is an argument that the federal government should not pay anything. One could argue that elections are state and local duty, and certainly state officials have pushed back whenever the feds have gotten involved. One could argue that, well, this is a fundamental constitutional right of the states to run their elections. Feds should stay out of it. On the other hand, that overlooks the fact that the federal government has been heavily involved in regulating elections from the very beginning. And in fact, one could argue that elections were the original unfunded mandate. So thing number one, the federal constitution mandates that states and localities run federal elections. Okay, they don't have any choice other than to have elections for Congress. And, practically speaking, they have to run them for the presidency, although we could talk about that. So the election mandate. On top of that, the federal government has mandated all sorts of activities that cost a lot of money with respect to overseas voters, military voters, with respect to voter registration, with respect to voting machines, voter registration systems, and the like. This stuff ain't cheap, and it needs to be renewed. And sometimes these $5 billion or so, $4 billion or so the federal government has given has been, for instance, after HAVA, to kind of correct some problems with what was going on locally, to mandate that states and localities do things, and then walk away. Okay, so question is there a way for the federal government to be responsible on an ongoing basis for these mandates? Okay, so I will just I will end here by just making a couple of notes. First of all, as Keith mentions, there seems to be a consensus for about, let's say among this group, about $500 million a year among. In my argument, I kind of run through various ways in which you might think about what the feds should cough up. And I think it's closer to $1 billion, quite frankly. And the argument I make, I won't go into the details here, but it's what I call the eyeballs argument, which is to say, if you take identical elections and you hold one in which there are federal offices on the race and one in which there's not federal offices on the race, you increase turnout by 50%, by between 50 and 100%, okay, just by it being a federal election. And so you get people flooding to the polls because it's a federal election. And if there's something we know about capacity utilization and those sorts of things, I can talk to y'all someday about something called the elbow of death, which is known in election administration these days. But the more you flood something with capacity, with system demand, like voters, the costs rise exponentially. So it seems to me that if we really figure out what it costs to run elections overall, the federal government should be on the hook for something about around a quarter to a third of what it costs to run elections. Finally, I'll just note that in the Biden budget, there is a proposal for roughly $10 billion over 10 years for state and local elections, plus support for the United States Postal Service. So it's roughly, and it's structured in a way that's front-loaded. I would argue that that's within the, kind of the ballpark of what I would argue to be a solid, a fact-based basis for supporting federal elections. But certainly this is an area that deserves greater attention, greater debate, and being the university professor, I'll just end by noting greater research. So thank you all for your time.
That was a nice move. I got stripped of my microphone by my chair. Just a quick programming note here before we have David Becker come up. For those in our live stream audience who are following by Zoom, you did the Zoom connection, that will end at 12:15. And we've got a really excellent panel after David coming up, so we want to let the discussion keep going. It will be available live, the live stream on our YouTube channel. And if you'll check the comments section on Zoom, you'll have the link to the YouTube. So if you'll move on over to that, we can continue the discussion. David?
Thanks, Keith. As Keith mentioned, I'm David Becker. I run the Center for Election Innovation and Research, which is a 501c3 that works with election officials for the last 6 or so years. And I've been in elections for about a quarter of a century, and see some other people in the room who have been with me about that long. Charles is absolutely right about the costs of elections. And I think one of the things that many people might not realize, those of us who work in elections every day know this because this is what we do. We're election nerds. But elections have always been underfunded. This has been a challenge that election officials have faced well before the challenges we saw in 2020 and 2016, et cetera. And we have to recognize, and this has been mentioned to some degree, that when we hold a national election, we are not holding a national election. We are holding about 10,000 little elections, all of which end at approximately the same time, but don't necessarily begin at the same time. Voting doesn't necessarily begin at the same time. In some states, we concentrate as much voting as we can into a single 12-hour period on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. And in some states, early voting goes on for almost a month. And that process relies on about 1 million human beings, mostly volunteers, but also county boards, municipal boards, secretaries of state's office, state boards of election. And it's incredibly complex and it's incredibly costly. And those costs are only increasing. The demands of our electorate are getting, appropriately, we have higher expectations, demands for better technology, demands for more speed, demands for more transparency during this process. And so that all of those things come with costs. Charles also alluded to this. Funding in the past, at least from the federal perspective, has only been episodic. We had some funding that came with the Help America Vote Act a little more than 15 years ago. In relation to the pandemic, there was about $400 million that was made available for elections in the CARES Act in 2020. That was just a drop in the bucket, really. We're talking about there are about 300 million eligible voters in the United States, so we're talking about just over $1 per eligible voter. And so election officials are having to make do as the demands for their services, as expectations go up, as costs go up, and funding isn't necessarily meeting that demand. I think the pandemic is one of the best examples of this. Going into 2020, we knew we were expecting probably record turnout. We, in fact, did see that record turnout, the highest turnout, both in terms of number of voters and percentage of voters since universal suffrage. More than 20 million more people cast ballots in the November 2020 election than any election before in American history. It's really remarkable. And if you think about the successes that election officials had in 2020 to manage that unexpectedly high, it was expectedly high, it just was off the charts on what they had dealt with before. In the middle of a global pandemic, when they had all of these other needs, they had to, for the first time, buy hand sanitizer, buy plexiglass, have PPE for their workers, their poll workers, for their staff. You can't run an election socially distanced. They had to be in the office. That meant their staffs were getting sick. They had to find a way to manage that kind of activity. These were all the challenges they faced in the pandemic, and they had a very small amount of funding from the federal government to help them manage that. And of course, this led to, just to put this all into context, philanthropy coming in and offering some money. Zuckerbucks were one of the challenging issues that have been raised, where Mark Zuckerberg provided some philanthropic assistance to election officials at their choice. My organization offered some of that to the states, another organization offered some of that to local election officials. And if you look at how that money was spent, my organization, you can go into electioninnovation.org. We put out a full transparent report on that back in March of 2021, so well over a year ago. That money was spent on educating voters about how to navigate the pandemic, for buying PPE, buying hand sanitizer, things along those lines. But I think everyone would admit that finding sources from philanthropy is not plan A, and it should never be plan A. Government should facilitate democracy. Government should take on the responsibility of fully funding democracy, whether it be the federal government or state governments, and there's obviously a role for both. So as Keith mentioned, I helped convene a group of over a dozen election officials of both parties from all over the country, from the state level and the local level, some of whom you're about to hear from, to kind of discuss this. And I think, again, one of the things that might surprise people, because a lot of the public discourse about election administration seems to be highly partisan and divisive. When you bring election officials together, there's actually a remarkable level of consensus. They know what it takes to run an election, to run the nuts and bolts of an election. And the election officials, with almost no exceptions, they have one concern, that is giving voice to their voters. So when you get them together, they're trying to figure out how to do that, and how to try to strengthen the guardrails around that and the transparency around that, so that everyone knows that the count was accurate and that they can go on to the next election. Election officials don't show up on the Monday before Election Day and say, let's put on an election. They're working 365 days a year to do that. So a couple of the consensus items that I think we heard from, and I think you'll hear more about shortly, is that there are a lot of new requirements. Some of them are natural, and some of them are coming legislatively in the aftermath of some of the disinformation about the 2020 election. So for instance, there are absolutely legitimate requirements with regard to new technology. There are absolutely legitimate requirements with regard to audits of elections, legitimate pre-certification audits, which almost every state does, and which cost money. There absolutely are requirements with regard to transparency, live streaming of counting processes and things like that. That costs money. So all of those things are legitimate. And then there are some things that have come about recently. For instance, requirements that drop boxes be under 24-hour surveillance. Whether that's necessary or not, I think we'll leave that to another day. But that costs money. You have to have human beings ready to do that. You have to have technology ready to do that. There are a variety of other requirements like that. And then the other big item of consensus that I think is important to note is that the funding should be ongoing. It should be regular. It should be something that election officials can plan for and not episodic. If they can't plan for it, they don't know how they should spend it. They don't know how they should hold it and use it. So for instance, with HAVA money, which came out in the aftermath of the 2000 election, there are states that still have some of that around a little bit because they're trying to spend it wisely. And that's actually been used against them as they've sought more funding because they've been diligent in their spending and how they've accounted for that money over time. So instead of election officials know there's going to be X amount of dollars that's going to be coming in on an annual basis or a biannual basis, and they can plan for that, that means they can hire staff and they don't have to worry if that staff's going to be around for the next election. They can buy new technology or set some aside for new technology that might be needed, not in the next year, but maybe in 5 or 6 years. So with that, I think I'll hand it back to you, Keith, to introduce the next panel. But I think those are the kinds of things that we see as we've been discussing this.
Good. Thank you, Charles and David. Again, just impressive expertise that we've been able to bring to bear to educate everyday Americans so that they could weigh in. As David mentioned, the opportunity to engage with state and local election officials who actually run our elections was just so useful. And there is the challenge in DC here as you consider measures that it can be a bit of an abstraction. And I think it's just really important to understand and hear the perspective of those who actually on the ground are running the elections. And so in the conversations that David helped us gather and hear their perspective. And we had a couple of sessions. We had a session with Senate staff from the group of 16 senators working on that, able to sort of connect Senate staff with local and state election officials directly. And I have to say that the senators have been awfully interested in getting that on the ground perspective, and we've appreciated that approach to it. So it is just really important to hear all that. Nice to have Charles and David kind of set the ground particularly on the funding issue. But I also think, again, back to the election worker security issue, it's awfully important that we hear from the people that are on the front line. So we have a very distinguished panel of state and local election officials, including a distinguished former state election official to moderate the panel, Trey Grayson, who is actually on NICD's advisory board and has been since its inception, and a friend of mine from long back. He's the former Secretary of State in Kentucky. And around that time and shortly after that was also president of the National Association of Secretaries of State, was chair of the Republican Secretaries of State Association, and was director of the Harvard Institute of Politics when I was there as a professor. Trey will be moderating the panel. And on the panel, we have, starting on the far end from me, Secretary of State Lee Chapman, who is the Pennsylvania Secretary of State. And then we have Al Schmidt, President and CEO of the Committee of 70 and former Philadelphia City Commissioner. You will notice the states we picked. So two, a state and a local election official from Pennsylvania. Seems like it's a question that's been relevant in Pennsylvania, and so we're glad to hear from the Pennsylvania perspective from Secretary Chapman and Al Schmidt. And then we have Bill Gates, closest to Trey, who is chair of the Maricopa County Board of Supervisors in Phoenix, Arizona, and surrounds. And again, I think that there's maybe been a few questions about elections administration in Arizona that are relevant. And so these folks have truly been on the front line. So we'll turn it over to them. And Trey, I'll turn it over to you for your panel.
Thanks, Keith. It's good to be with all of you this afternoon. I think it's appropriate that election administrators get the last word. Sometimes we don't get any word at all when it comes to advocacy groups and policymakers. But I think of this process, and it sounds like, and the senators and other members of Congress who are looking at what to do, election administrators' voices are loud and being listened to. So I really appreciate that. This is a good segue because the last two speakers, Charles talked about the funding needs, and David talked about how we convened a panel, and the folks to my right were part of that conversation about how to spend money. But I think also we've heard a lot about some other areas of the election. So what I want to do is let each of you three, and we did let a non-Commonwealth person in, you're just a state.
Yeah.
I mean, you're local, but you're part of a state. I mean, the three of us, we're from Commonwealths, and we know that's much better. But I thought I'd just let the three of us, kind of kick it off and tell me, you can talk about funding, you can talk about the election worker security, Presidential Transition Act, Electoral Count Act, whatever strikes your fancy. They're giving us the last word. So why don't I start with Bill?
Great. Thank you. Really honored to be here. It's a fantastic discussion. Yeah, maybe I can talk to you guys later because I have no idea what a Commonwealth is. So,
it's just awesome.
So
you're just missing out.
Look forward to learning about that. Again, great discussion today. We have Maricopa County. We have been in the news a lot, obviously, dealing with the cyber ninjas. We couldn't get anyone from the cyber ninjas to be here today for some reason, but it continues to go on even to this day in Maricopa County, where my colleagues and I in the Board of Supervisors are still subject to a criminal investigation by our Attorney General, who is acting upon the Cyber Ninja report. And of course, he's running for the U.S. Senate, so he continues to string this out. So these are the real world issues that we are dealing with on the level where we're trying to, as our head of elections, because we hire an election day operations professional, and his joke is that during the day, he's kind of dealing with the people who want to relitigate the 2020 election, and then at night, he's preparing for the 2022 election. So that's what we have. Great discussions, and there's no question that there needs to be reform on the Electoral College Act, presidential transition. But to me, if people can't feel safe in serving as election workers, all the rest of that is just talk. So I am a conservative Republican. I am a federalist. I believe in states' rights. Having said all of that, I think we are in a situation where we need to look at perhaps some strengthened federal criminal laws. Because the problem is, when you have the possibility of having, for example, a Secretary of State and Attorney General who are openly hostile, these are the leading candidates right now, both endorsed by President Trump, are openly hostile to my board and to the elections workers, we're going to need protection. We do need protection. So again, I don't say that lightly. Federal funding also, I think, to harden the targets, I hate to say, where we count our elections, where we count the election votes. We need to protect that. We're working very closely with our sheriff to protect our elections workers and our voters. So I think some federal funding might make sense there too.
Thanks, Bill. Al.
I want to start by saying thank you, and in no way feel like the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania is overrepresented on this panel, given that we're the birthplace of democracy in America. I think it's only appropriate. And unfortunately, it also makes us the target of a lot of misinformation and disinformation and efforts to discredit election outcomes in Pennsylvania, specifically targeting Philadelphia. And to quickly tie together a couple of the other panels, whether it's Electoral Count Act, Presidential Reform, Presidential Transition Act, ordinary voters may not know the names of those things or think about them on their way to drop off their kids at school or through their busy lives, but they definitely know about them, and they know about them indirectly. They interact with our election board workers, and they say, Pence should have done this or that. Not necessarily concerned about the wording of legislation, but it's an opportunity that bad faith actors have used to misinform the public, disinform the public, resulting in threats and sort of verbal aggression directed at our election board workers. Another opportunity is because of the lack of funding. When there's inadequate funding, there's inadequate training and inadequate equipment, likely leading to a greater opportunity for mistakes to take place, not necessarily fraud or some purposeful underhanded thing, but more likely that a mistake would take place in an environment where every mistake is perceived as being the result of a calculated effort to change the outcome of the election. So whether it's whether it's legislative reform or funding, in a very real way, on an ordinary level, our election board workers have to struggle with that and ultimately pay the price of it.
Thanks, Al. Secretary Chapman, you were returning to the office. You used to work in the office back in the Halcyon days in 2016, 2017. And welcome, and
Thank you.
Congratulations on your appointment.
Thank you. So I'm Lee Chapman, Acting Secretary of State of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. I've been in this role since January. I was previously Policy Director, which you're referring to in Pennsylvania during the 2016 election. But I've really spent the last decade of my career working for nonprofit, nonpartisan organizations, advocating for election reform. I'm also an attorney by background. But just to piggyback on the conversation that we're having now, and also Professor Charles Stewart's presentation and David Becker's presentation, there really is a need for us to have an adequate, reliable funding stream for elections. When you look at Pennsylvania, in recent years, we've really almost had a perfect storm that has exposed the need for funding. In 2019, all of our 67 counties replaced our voting machines. So they now have a voter verifiable paper ballot. And we were able to do that through a $90 million bond from the state. But, machines, they die. Your computer only lasts a couple of years. These machines will probably only last around 8 to 10 years, and there's really there's no funding stream to replace those machines once they die. So that's something that's a need. Another thing, in 2019, the legislature in Pennsylvania passed Act 77, which brought no excuse mail-in voting to the state. Prior in Pennsylvania, you had to have an excuse to vote absentee. So it really expanded the number of people who could use mail-in voting. And to date, we've had around 5.3 million people take advantage of that. You know, both Republicans and Democrats have taken advantage of mail-in voting, but it put a huge strain on counties to purchase equipment that could process, you know, these millions of vote-by-mail ballots. And if it wasn't for that outside funding that came through philanthropy, you know, a lot of counties wouldn't have been able to execute the 2020 election without that funding. And then finally, I would also say, you know, upgrades to our statewide voter registry. So our election system in Pennsylvania, as far as our voter registration and election management system, is over 20 years old. So we're talking about technology that really is ancient. So we're in the process of upgrading that statewide. And, you know, counties need to have an infrastructure. They need new laptops. They need keys so they can use multi-factor authentication, you know, really bringing things into current times. And, you know, we received a recent allocation from Help America Vote Act, but Pennsylvania only received $2 million. And when you divide that by 67 counties, you know, some of the smaller counties only got a few $1,000s, which really is not sufficient to fund anything. So, you know, in Pennsylvania, 67 counties, you know, rural counties, urban counties, you know, more Republican-leaning counties than Democrat counties. But one thing that everyone can agree on, all 67 county election officials can agree on, is that need for reliable and consistent funding to make sure that we have secure elections.
So one thing that was striking to me about the Comments in America participant findings was the relatively low level of support for funding. And as Keith noted, actually seemed going down a little bit the longer the window was open. And I tend to agree with his explanation of why perhaps had gone down. Bill and Al, even though you're the last couple of years have been very high profile in your election space, in your former elected position and current elected position, you actually oversee a lot of other areas than just elections, because you really oversee, you know, you're city commissioner, county commissioner. Talk about funding in the context of, you know, the challenge of getting a budget approved to do this, or to run an election that elects at the state level, the local level, and federal level candidates, and all this, you know, balancing all those priorities. And maybe, you know, I'm selfish. I think we need more money, and so I want to help maybe the three of you to, like, well, let's drill down on this funding thing. Let's further make this case, because we got some staffers here. Maybe go back to their bosses and say, yeah, we really need to do this.
Yeah, so for us in Maricopa County, we're actually in 50 lines of business. So it's massive. This is kind of what we're famous or infamous for now, but we do so many other things. In fact, we just approved our budget, $4.5 billion budget. Maricopa County is the fourth largest county in the country, but it's incredibly difficult to try and balance all of this. The state has sort of said they would cover elections for us, but it's always a fight. And again, they're now openly hostile to us. They tried to, as many of you may know, they came within, the state Senate came within one vote of throwing my colleagues and I in jail. So, you know, chances of getting more funding are very limited. The one thing I would say on a positive, to a positive extent, is that there is a lot more focus on elections than we used to have. So I think with some folks, we would be more likely to get that funding. But again, sort of relying on state legislature is very challenging. Also, David referenced the philanthropy, and we did have some Zuckerbucks in Maricopa County, but then in the 2021 session, the legislature prohibited it. So that's fine. If they're going to prohibit it, then they need to step up. And again, that continues to be a challenge.
Oh.
I mean, I think we're fortunate in Philadelphia to really have a mayor and a city council that values elections and supports them with resources. That does not mean it's not a significant fight every budget cycle to try to get more. That's only natural, competing with all the other issues that our mayor and city council have to wrestle with. So a lot of that makes sense. But in terms of resources, whether it's from the state or the federal government, I just want to stress what the Secretary said, which is how important it is to have those resources coming your way in a way that you can plan for them. And it's not just feast and famine one year to the next. And as David pointed out, when you try to spend the money in a way that's responsible and not sort of just push it out the door, you end up being accused of just sitting on resources and like you don't actually need them. Our relationship with the state legislature is a much more tenuous one. While they passed Act 77, which brought no excuse mail-in ballot voting to Pennsylvania, they've been unwilling to adopt other reforms that will make elections more efficient, effective, and save us a lot of money, like allowing us to begin processing mail-in ballots envelopes prior to election morning. Right now, we can only begin at 7 o'clock in the morning. So that means we need that many more temporary employees, that many more employees through the rest of the city government working for us 24 hours a day, which is not a very efficient and effective way to do things. A couple of additional reforms would go a long way to reducing our costs as well.
Al, you hinted this, but let me just do a quick follow-up. Could you explain what processing means? Because I think there's some confusion about what that means, and if there was a better understanding what we mean in the elections community by processing mail-in ballots, there might be less reluctance to adopt that kind of reform, setting aside partisan politics and things like that.
Processing, at least from our perspective, really means all the steps that are involved with counting a mail-in ballot before a single vote is actually counted, before that ballot in that envelope, in the other envelope, ever goes through a scanner or gets counted at the end of the kind of assembly line. But there's a lot of work that goes into it before that. We have to review the outer sufficiency of the declaration envelope to make sure the voter filled it out and signed it, and whether they dated it or not, or all the rest. That envelope has to be opened, and then the secrecy envelope is taken out, and then that envelope has to be opened, and then the ballot has to be taken out and flattened, and it all seems very mundane. But when we're doing 375,000 of them, and a president is saying, why haven't they finished counting yet on election night? It's because this takes many, many, many days for us to do.
Yeah, essentially, you're doing all the check, and it's more complicated than election day voting or in-person voting, but it's all the stuff that you do right before you put the ballot in the scanner. You have to do all that, and that's what that processing means. You're not counting the votes. Nobody knows any results from those votes.
That's right. Yeah. And many other states have, made those changes. Florida can report most of its mail-in ballot results on election night, and it's really irritating for us to look up to Florida to see how to do elections right. So,
I'll take it for Florida. Well, Florida's actually a good case study because we've been talking about Florida and joking about Florida, crying about Florida for the last couple of decades. But Florida's actually done a nice job of becoming more of a model. I mean, even Kentucky, we don't have. You still need an excuse to vote by mail, but even we gave the processing power to our election administrators last year because we recognized that they need to have that flexibility. So, Secretary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would just say, I think it's important that the bulk of the money really goes to the counties because county elections are operated at the local level, administered at the local level. But we can't lose sight of the actual state's role in this as well. Pennsylvania is the 5th largest state, but we actually have one of the smallest election departments at the state level. The only states that have smaller ones are Rhode Island, North Dakota, and I believe Idaho. So one thing that we did request in this year's budget was 20 new positions for our state to help support counties with running elections because we have a statewide voter registration database, which was required by law. We're upgrading that now. So we need to have that infrastructure as well at the state level to make sure that we are supporting our 67 counties and giving them, what they need to make sure that every voter can cast their ballot. So, that federal funding and state funding is also needed at the state level as well.
A lot of times when we think about funding, we think about using funding for technology, for voting systems, for voter registration, statewide voter registration systems, things like that, for cybersecurity initiatives and things like that. A lot of our money, though, in elections goes to pay people. You talked about needing more people, but we also I think we're all reminded in the election space with the moving testimony of the mother and daughter from Fulton County, who unfortunately had their lives upended merely by being good citizens. But those are the folks without whom elections can't work. And let's talk a little bit about the need for having people, sometimes they're getting paid, but they're getting paid so little they're effectively volunteers. We also rely upon volunteers, and sort of that personnel aspect of elections and some of the challenges you maybe are facing or may face, some of which are related to funding, some of which are maybe related to, we might need some more protection, things like that. But let's talk about that kind of the human element. Now, you were part of that panel discussion as well, and have had to deal with this. But Bill, let's start with you.
Yeah, I mean, that's a critical issue for us. We have to hire 3,000 temporary workers for our upcoming August election. So again, we all know it's such a tough labor market. We're competing. Those folks are also, Amazon wants them in their warehouses, and it's all the same people, fast food restaurants, everything. So you've got to compete for those folks. So there needs to be at least enough money to entice them in. Then when they hear the stories about the threats, it's a real concern. And so knowing that there were additional protections out there, I think would be very helpful for folks. But again, I don't want to be all negative. And I'm finding, I've had young people coming up to me as I've been speaking at different things, where they're now inspired to get into a career in elections because they believe that our democracy is on the line. So I think there's a positive story to this too, where before it maybe was kind of a sleepy job, this is just ministerial. And now they see themselves on the front lines of saving this democracy.
That's a really good point, Bill. Oh.
They do, and they're on the front lines of saving this democracy when in Pennsylvania, nearly every county got new voting systems, right? So they're not the old machines that these election board workers who have worked those polls for the last 15 years have been doing. Now they're working with something much more seemingly complicated than what they were familiar with, and mail-in ballot voting as well, and the interfacing of mail-in ballot voting and in-person voting to make sure that a voter who's returned their ballot doesn't vote on the machine, because that vote can't be taken out, the egg can't be sort of unscrambled. So it's gotten a lot more complicated. They're facing a lot more grief from people. And at the same time, we're paying them less than minimum wage when you break out the total number of hours election board workers work from before our polls open till the machines are closed down and the results are submitted.
Secretary.
Yeah, in recent years, we've had about 30 election directors in counties retire or leave their job because of threats or various reasons, which is, really concerning when it comes to, administering elections, because we're really having a new crop of people come in. So, we're trying to think creatively about the best way we can support these new election directors, as they're implementing an election with, as Al said, new machines with vote by mail. So we've implemented county office hours where every other week our staff at the Department of State, we just get on the phone and ask people, do you have any questions? How can we help you? How can we be supportive? But with that transition, with so many people leaving, we have to make sure that they are onboarded and they actually have the tools in order to execute an election.
Yeah, that transition in election administration is big. I think the States United Democracy Center estimates about 20% are planning to leave or will leave over the next couple of years. And even in a non-battleground state like my own, we're seeing at the county clerk level, which is the local election administrator, we'll have at least 20% new ones next year. It's an elected position. We may have a little more if some lose re-election. It's a lot of expertise that's departing, so we have to work on that. We've had a great conversation up here with the four of us. I want to see if anybody in the audience has any questions for our esteemed panel. Yes. And I think there's a mic. You got a microphone? Yeah. Hold on a second.
Thanks. Is this working? Is this working? Yeah.
Yep.
So I said this morning that elections now are taking place in this pervasive sea of distrust, and I think that has implications for election administration, and things that would be fine under non-toxic conditions, are making the system much more vulnerable given this distrust. And this has to do with the relationship between state and local election administration. So as you've said, our elections are highly decentralized, Counties play this very, very significant role. But I think in this context, we need more consistency from the state level about election administration. So for example, while it may be fine in normal times to have each county decide whether you have an opportunity to cure a defect on an absentee ballot, I think in these circumstances, we need secretaries of state, other election officials to actually try to bring as much consistency on a statewide basis to the process as possible. There are, of course, reasons that you do have to have county-based differences. I mean, there are certain things that you just can't do the same in a large urban county as a more rural county. But, you know, in all of these areas where it is possible to bring uniformity at the state level without compromising that too much, I think that's extremely important to actually going forward. And I think some of the secretaries of state made a mistake in the 2020 election, not taking a more assertive role through guidance to actually bring that kind of consistency to the process. I'm curious what your thoughts are about that.
Sure. Anybody want to dive in first on that? Bill?
Well, I could just real briefly, I agree with that. And that's one of the things I say to people when they, you know, we have these various attacks on a daily basis. I say, look, we don't make the rules, the state does. Tell us the rules, we will follow them. But one of the challenges we have is that our Secretary of State, who's a Democrat, and our Attorney General, who's a Republican, have been, I don't want to say battling, because I don't think that's fair to the Secretary of State. The Attorney General has basically said, I'm not going to defend you, I'm not going to be your lawyer anymore. In fact, I'm going to sue you. So talk about chaos. So this is one of the problems that we have, and I would get back to the point that was made earlier about professionalizing. The extent to which we can professionalize things, it's going to be better. We're fortunate at Maricopa County because we have a bipartisan board. We've worked in a bipartisan fashion. We have professionals who run both the mail-in side of the House and the election day side of the House who've been in place for years. So I think that helps as well. But certainly, the more uniformity and agreement at the state level, the better.
And Philadelphia is obviously very different than a lot of the rural counties in Pennsylvania. So you're actually a perfect poster child for this because there is such a variety in the states. Secretary, I want to start with you.
Yeah, I would just say, you know, it depends on the state, given, you know, the Secretary of State's authority to issue both guidance and directives. So in Pennsylvania, I can issue guidance. I can also issue directives. My directive authority is limited to voting systems. And, you know, guidance, we expect counties to follow it, but they don't necessarily have to. But yes, like we definitely look to see what guidance we can give to counties when it comes to, you know, various issues. And a lot of times the counties ask for it. A lot of times that guidance is driven by court decisions. And in court cases, as you can imagine, recently there have been court cases around undated ballots in Pennsylvania. So we issued guidance on that. So, you know, it really varies on the state and the level of authority that a secretary has for that.
And I can say that even though we're in different parties, we really benefited from the guidance from the secretary in her department. While we always wish we could get that guidance earlier, and everything you described is true, it's even more so in Pennsylvania's case because mail-in ballot voting is new. And there is litigation whether to count ballots that are not hand-dated by the voter or not count them. And it reduces the opportunity for some counties to count them, some to not count them, or some to count them but count them separately and submit them along with our certification results so that when things get sorted out in the courts, then determination can be made then. But I think Pennsylvania is a good example of a state or a Commonwealth going through a lot of these struggles right now with a new system of voting for us.
Yeah, you'll have to work through that. And I think cybersecurity and the implementation of cybersecurity measures, that's another one that's probably more likely to have a lot of variability, from jurisdiction to jurisdiction by resource and size and sophistication. Great question. Other questions from anyone in the audience? Yes, I see.
Thank you. Great panel. Thank you so much. My question is, besides voting, what can everyday Americans do who are concerned about this as well? Do you have some guidance for everyday Americans?
Anybody want to jump in on that one? Al.
Even though we described how difficult it is to be an election board worker, it would be to be an election board worker. And I would encourage people who want to support our democracy at this difficult time to get involved and do that. And I would encourage people who have real concerns about election integrity and all the rest at this difficult time to do that, because in our experience, the more you know about elections, the less likely you are to spread or parrot the sort of things that you're hearing that are totally far-fetched. It's not going to prevent people from believing that Italian satellites are switching votes in voting systems that we don't even have in Philadelphia. But it will go a long way, I think, to restoring trust in the democratic process.
And I would just add, support candidates who are supportive of our elections workers. I mean, to me, that's really where it's all at. And I'm not going to state what party you might be in, but especially these Republican primaries that are going on right now. Those candidates who are openly hostile to election workers, who are spreading this disinformation, they need to be defeated for the future of the party and the republic, in my opinion.
And if somebody were to do a Google search in Arizona, you would discover there is one Republican running for Secretary of State who is unlike the others in a good way.
And
I think I'll say it.
I have one more thing to add. I would just say also share reliable and accurate information. We didn't really get into mis and disinfo, but we touched on it a little bit. Sharing information about how to vote in the elections process, from a Secretary of State's account or from your local Board of Elections account. Just making sure that people have that accurate information is important.
Yeah, and if I'll just go ahead and answer this one too, because it's a great question. It's one of these things where elections for many people were a black box, not on a conspiracy standpoint, just in they didn't know. They go vote, they don't know all these safeguards, and so we election officials are probably caught a little bit off guard in the kinds of questions we've been getting, and the reasons why, how much transparency is in the system, how we actually utilize bipartisanship to put Republicans and Democrats and independents, in the room. Not just observe, but sometimes actually count, because we want to eliminate that doubt, and that there are these partisan actors who are representing their party's interests, but that are a critical part of this machinery. And so, there are opportunities. There are a lot more reporters that cover elections nowadays, and sometimes, they ask a lot of questions. They have to justify their beat, but it's helpful. It's another way to get the word out. But it's thank you for that question. It's a really good one. Anybody else? All right. Well, I'm going to kick it back to Keith to wrap this up. Thanks to the panel for not just participating today, but what you do as guardians of democracy for helping our elections and in a really hard time. So thank you.
The phrase "guardians of democracy" will be one of the phrases that resonates with me after today. I really think that appropriately captures it. And, again, our thanks to these state and local election officials, and by proxy for the 1 million, was it 1 million workers, David, that are out there making it possible for this to be a government by, for, and of the people, and how critical that is. And just thank you for bringing it into the room, just how real it is on the front lines for this. So we'll wrap up now, and I just again want to thank all of the 11 participants that we had on the panel. I think it's been a master class in how elections are run and what we can do to increase confidence in elections. If we could just have another round of applause for all 11 of them. And I want to thank the staff at the National Institute for Civil Discourse that have put in a ton of work to making this happen. If you can all just stand up, and I'll just name them quickly: Bonnie Lepard, Mia Ayer, Jason Hahn, Cheryl Gravy, Tim Schaefer, who's not with us here, Helen Witharm, and Austin Orfield. If you could all stand up, and our thanks to all of you. Good, and our thanks to the good folks at Blue Light Strategy, Steve Rabinowitz and Matt Landini, who are here, who help us get the word out. Thanks to you. I also want to, really thank our members, the 42,000 Americans who have joined out of a conviction that we need to engage our differences more constructively and that we can find measures wise enough to attract broad bipartisan support and then engage Congress with them. I want to also thank the courageous members of Congress who are working on this. We have staff from several of the senators, the group of 16 senators, Common Sense Coalition, led by Senators Manchin and Collins, who are really have been working hard for many months to do this. The good and courageous leaders in the House of Representatives, including Representative Zoe Lofgren, Representative Liz Cheney, and those on the House Admin and House Rules Committees who are working on that. It is sometimes not easy to do the kind of bipartisan work in Congress today, but that is such critical work that they're doing, and we really are getting into crunch time now, and so we so appreciate their leadership and hard work on that. I want to close by juxtaposing two themes I felt in this tonight, and one in this program today. I'll go with a point that Norm Ornstein was making about the gravity of the challenges before us and the threats that we face. I'll just tell you that my personal experience as I've become educated as we've done our work on this and had the privilege of talking to the leading experts in the country, I've had some nights, I'm a pretty good sleeper, I've had some nights when it's been hard to go to sleep. These are folks who are not sky is falling alarmist folks. These are serious, substantive folks with long experience. They are serious-minded. And when they have outlined for me the kinds of threats that we're facing, it has truly, and I tend to be an optimist. I sleep well and I'm an optimist. But it is hard to escape just how real, substantive the threat is to what has been the most successful republic in world history. It absolutely depends. It is bedrock that we are able to trust the outcomes of our elections, that we chose our officials by the voice of the people. It is essential to this remarkable system of government that we have, and the threats to it are grave. I want to kind of emphasize that, and then I want to juxtapose it with this point, and that is, if you have a serious discussion about are there practical, meaningful things that we can do in this country, in this Congress, in this year, that would meaningfully improve our trust in elections, you find striking consensus. You find striking consensus among experts, among elections leaders, among everyday Americans, and a very critical mass in the Congress that believe that. I think it is just imperative that those leaders in the Congress move forward and act, and that all of us do what we can to support their good work. Thank you for coming out today. It's been good to have you with us.